Hello and welcome back to You Want to Do What with Dan and Julie. Today we have Dr. Chris Naunton on. Hi Chris, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, very good, thanks. How are you?
Good, good. So you're an Egyptologist. Do you want to tell everyone a bit about what that actually is?
Yes. Um, so an Egyptologist is somebody who studies Egypt and specifically, although it's not implicit in the name, it's the study of ancient Egypt, um, usually defined as being down to the time of the Arab conquest. So we're talking about from sort of prehistoric Neolithic Egypt down to roughly the 7th century AD.
Wow.
So I am somebody who studied hieroglyphs, the ancient Egyptian language. I can read hieroglyphs. I studied pyramids, mummies, Tutankhamun, all of those things that people will have heard of, I hope.
I'm a bit of a history buff, so
Uh,
that's a very, very cool job to me.
it's fun. I mean, I studied ancient history and archaeology at university, and I wanted to do that, having watched TV documentaries and maybe read a book or two in my teens, and I had not much ambition beyond wanting to get a degree and to do it in the most interesting, least boring way that I could. And so I suppose that's a long way of saying, yeah, I was interested in ancient Egypt specifically, and archaeology and ancient history more generally, as a kid, and I still am, even now I'm grown up.
I guess Egyptology, history as a field, um, I guess the general public don't really know of many historians that specialise in, say, I don't know, ancient Rome or ancient Greece, whereas Egyptology is a real known sort of part of history. Do you
Yeah.
think that's because we have such a good record of all the kings that have been throughout the history, and you can date things to know, you can know when they built the pyramids, for example?
Yeah, it's difficult to put your finger on that actually, and I should maybe say as well that I've been doing Egyptology for about 20 years professionally, and I'm now freelance. I make my living from writing a bit of TV and media work, public speaking, tours to Egypt, that kind of thing. And it's difficult to think of another or too many other ancient cultures, at least, in which there's enough opportunities to make a living like that.
Mm.
I think that's partly to do, as you say, with a kind of abundance of evidence, and there's enough for us to know, enough kinds of evidence of different kinds. So monumental, you can go and see spectacular remains of ancient Egyptian civilization. There's textual evidence, so we've got quite long texts of various kinds, everything from sort of poetry to historical accounts for people to get their teeth into. And as a result of all of this, we do know, um, although there are enormous gaps and there's an awful lot that we don't know, there's enough for us to be able to string together quite a nice narrative of the history of Egypt. And then for some reason, and I'm never really sure that I can quite put my finger on this, and I do get asked a lot, why is ancient Egypt so popular
Mm.
with people? But it's true, it is, for one reason or another, and so I think that sort of contributes to Egypt being visible in museums, being visible on TV, in the bookshelves, and in terms of there being people like me out there who do this kind of thing.
I was going to say, do you think it stems back from when we were, going to all these different countries, 100, maybe even 150 different years ago, and we were bringing back, obelisks and artifacts? Do you
Hmm.
think it's just because it's in the national psyche that, when you think history, you automatically go to Egypt?
Yes, I'm sure you're right about that. And that's a very relevant question to ask, and a very sort of relevant way of thinking about it. Egypt is one of a series of sort of um, old world kind of colonialist parts of the world, in which were visited by countries like Britain, France, Germany in the 19th and 20th centuries, for lots of other reasons: political, territorial, military, etc. And those countries just happen to be very rich archaeologically as well. Countries in sort of North Africa, Middle East, Mediterranean. And so yes, it is certainly partly to do with that we have, as you rightly point out, lots of objects in museums, even monuments which in some cases are in public spaces like Cleopatra's Needle on the Thames, or that kind of thing. And yeah, that is a result of more recent history and this country, the UK's presence and involvement in Egypt and other countries in the region. This is something that we have to think very critically about these days, and about all of the ways in which what we know about the ancient past in those places has come about because of a slightly dubious series of happenings in our own country's history.
Yeah. I think the other thing is, thinking back a minute, I think the Egyptians were probably the oldest civilization I ever learned at school, outside of actually studying history by myself. And also, I suppose, its biblical ties makes it quite a prominent era for most people.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yes. Egypt tends to be, I'm sure you've noticed this in sort of general history books, on the history of whatever it is, transport, art, sculpture, the economy, anybody who's ever trying to sort of tell the history of that thing globally, it tends to be, the first thing that gets said is, well, in ancient Egypt, and actually Egyptians, it is true that the Egyptian society became very sophisticated and complex at a very early point in time. There are societies in Mesopotamia which were maybe as sophisticated and complex, that arose at around the same time, but none of them perhaps were quite as enduring as ancient Egypt. I think that's the other thing is the other thing to remember is that Egypt, in terms of its the way we sort of define it and the way we recognize it. So in terms of architectural features like pyramids, and in terms of language, the hieroglyphic script, the way that human beings and gods and goddesses are depicted in art. So if you think of the typical sort of walk like an Egyptian scene from Egyptian art, all of that is consistent with changes, but it's more or less consistent for almost 3,000 years, which it is quite staggering in itself. But it also means that culture lasted longer than almost any other ancient culture. So it had a long time, to kind of put down roots. And you're right, the fact that it's in the Bible as well is very important for our recognition of it now.
Why do you think it was able to survive for 3,000 years? Obviously, they had the early, middle, and late kingdoms, or however you refer to them now. But how did a civilization in the ancient times last for 3,000 years?
That's a great question. I've not done the comparisons, but obviously, ancient Egyptian civilization, lasted as long as it did with all of these spectacular achievements, monumental building and such like, for much longer than our own, supposedly great and sophisticated civilization. We haven't hit that 3,000 year point yet. So we probably need to wait a few thousand years before we start to understand why in some places societies are able to endure. Egypt is geographically, it's very well placed, in that the territory to the east and west of it is uninhabitable. the territory to the north is the ocean, the Mediterranean. And to the south, actually, the Nile Valley becomes much less habitable. It's much less suitable for settlement, permanent settlement. It's also very rich, agriculturally in particular. So Egypt never had any trouble feeding itself. So, you know, it's well defended from external threats. It's wealthy. Just what it is that meant that it was able to cultivate sophisticated systems of writing, that kind of thing, as early as it did. Quite, you know, why it is that those things developed in the Nile Valley, we're still sort of trying to understand. But I mean, yeah, you know, let's wait and see. I mean, if our modern Western society outlasts Egypt, then we can look for reasons why. But I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't.
Yeah, very true. Do you have a favourite sort of time period or pharaoh within ancient Egypt?
Well, I did my doctoral research on the period of the Egyptian 25th dynasty, which occurred over a period of just short of a century between roughly 750 BC and 650. What interests me about that is that it was a time when Egypt was taken over by a group of relatively little known kings from another kingdom called Kush to the south of Egypt in what is now Sudan. And that society had adopted a lot of Egyptian customs and took advantage of a weakened Egypt to take it over. So I guess I've got a sort of soft spot for that, but mostly thanks to the public sort of fascination with Tutankhamun, and actually the period that came immediately before Tutankhamun's reign, under the Pharaoh Akhenaten. I've ended up doing a lot of work on that time, and that's become a bit of a favourite of mine as well. It's sort of shunned by a lot of Egyptologists precisely because it's so popular and so well known in the public. And I think a lot of specialists and academics prefer to shy away from things that are popular. You know, it's that kind of thing where you know, you want to do something slightly more obscure, you know, maybe because there's more scope for doing something new. And I was a bit like that too for a while. I was kind of a bit like, oh well, you know, I'm a specialist actually, so I'm not really interested in King Tut. But I, like I say, I mean, television work in particular has drawn me to get interested and involved in that. And it really is an incredible time. So when people ask me if you'd ask me if I could go back to a particular point, I would absolutely love to know what happened to the burial of Akhenaten, when that happened, who was responsible, what happened to Akhenaten's principal wife Nefertiti, because these are all things which, again, going back to that idea of a sort of abundance of evidence, these are things that, because there's lots of evidence, we kind of feel as though we should know really well, like we should almost know day by day what was happening. But actually that's not the nature of archaeological and, you know, evidence for the ancient world, which there's still these huge gaps. So we kind of feel like we're really close to knowing, and we can tell a good story, but there's still enough gaps for it to be really tantalizing for us to not exactly be able to say what happened. So if I could go back to a particular place in time, it would be the Valley of the Kings towards the end of King Tut's reign, I think.
Wow. So we had an archaeologist on recently, actually, and she was talking about how they're using satellites to image the desert, to look for pyramids and tombs, and what are we currently looking for in Egypt, or what are, you know, Egyptologists like yourselves really looking for?
That's a good question. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of archaeological teams working in Egypt every year, and each of them has you know, their own reason for being wherever it is they are. They're not necessarily searching for searching for particular things. It's not necessarily like a sort of treasure hunt where you go grubbing around with a particular thing in mind, and hoping you might find it, and it's not there, but ta-da, here it is. A lot of the time it's more to do with adding slowly, gradually to the data set about a particular thing. Having said that, the satellite imagery sort of approach is, I'd say in Egypt, it's one of a series of remote sensing techniques which can be used to look at Egypt in a kind of zoomed out way, if you like. So in the past, because Egypt is so abundant in archaeological material, if you were in the right place, so if you were in, for example, a very rich cemetery site like Saqqara or Giza, or the cemeteries around the Valley of the Kings, that kind of general area, it's almost the case that if you stick a spade in the ground, you'll find something.
Wow.
So there was a time in the past where, if you just wanted to kind of find pretty things, that was the thing to do. These days, as I say, we're sort of taking a more zoomed out approach. So there's still plenty of that sort of material to see. But if you begin to look at Egypt on a kind of regional level, you can begin to see things like settlement patterns and the way that political geography in Egypt changed over time. So the capital city, for example, shifted. For most of the time, it was at the boundary between the Nile Delta and the Nile Valley, but it was in different places at different times, and that might have been to do with which particular part of the country was strategically most useful, or it might have been to do with environmental change. So something we've only just begun to see in the last few years is that the river moved. The River Nile moved.
Wow.
It can move hundreds of meters from east to west, and that's dramatically affected obviously the settlement patterns, in that you might get a situation where on one bank of the river's moving away, which is freeing up land, to put it sort of crudely, kind of almost land in front of your front garden, which means that you can build a new house, which is great. So that the town or the village might begin to expand on that side, whereas on the other side of the river's moving towards you, and it's beginning to sort of lap up against your house and in through your front door, which means that you've got to either knock down your house and build it again 10 meters away, or more likely you move somewhere else altogether. And we can begin to see now that actually probably the most sort of headline grabbing example of how we now understand things to have developed is that the temples of Karnak, which are one of the most spectacular sets of monuments still standing in Egypt, were probably originally built on an island, very deliberately, because islands have a kind of cosmological significance for the ancient Egyptians. They believe that all life sprang forth in primordial times from an island. So this is where they built the temples, and that's not an island anymore, because the channel that ran around the eastern side of that temple has completely dried up, and the temple's now firmly on the eastern bank of the river. Wow. But the more we can begin to see these things, the more we can begin to answer questions like where exactly Memphis was, because we're still not quite sure where it was in the earliest time. But it may well be, in fact, that the reason we don't have the remains of that ancient city from the earliest period is because the river has moved and swallowed it up, or it's meant that it's not quite in the place we were expecting it to be in relation to the river, if that makes sense.
It goes back to that being 3,000 years of society, and over that time, like you say, geography literally changed and moved cities.
Yeah, that's right.
Man.
Well, I mean, we can actually see there's a small number of archaeologists who also have a kind of specialism in environmental science or geology, who are leading this research, and they're able to show that this kind of thing is also happening, of course, still today, to a lesser extent maybe, because the damming of the River Nile now means that the river is much more controlled than it used to be in ancient times. But still, they can show that these river channels and islands can form in the space of decades. So you're absolutely right. When you're talking about a civilization which endured for 3,000 years, of course, you'd have an awful lot of that kind of change.
That's
and
that's
the
really
impact that
crazy.
has on the mentality of the Egyptians as well is really interesting. They worshipped the river as a god. They sort of there was the idea of the river being embodied as a god, who they called Hapi. And of course, if one day the river doesn't flood, it doesn't deposit water on your land, and your crops don't grow, then of course
I suppose the Nile is all their source of life there, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, and it could be vengeful. If it decides to start eating up your house as well, you'd be wondering what you were doing wrong or what you needed to do to make things different.
Could you talk us through your progress to education?
So I went, as I mentioned, to university to study ancient history and archaeology. I'd done history and classics at school. And those were really the things that interested me, more than anything else. I mean, like everybody else at school, I wanted to play football, and I wanted to play the guitar and be a rock star or a footballer or something like that. But in terms of my studies, it was kind of history and that sort of thing that interested me the most. And I do remember, I have a very clear memory of asking my history teacher, kind of jokingly, we had a good relationship when I was in the sixth form, why we don't do more ancient things. And as I mentioned, I was doing a classics A level as well, so I was getting interested not just in the text that we were reading for the exams, but in the history behind that, and ancient Greece and that sort of thing. And I think things like Greek mythology, as well as the ancient Egyptians, are things that are generally popular with people at that sort of age. So when I had the opportunity to go and do this at university, with all the support of my family, I went off to do this, and I wasn't a very academic student, really. I went to a good school, and I was able to go to university. Didn't have a gap year or anything like that, but I wasn't particularly expecting to do well. I was just hoping to get through, and get a degree at the end of it, because that's what you were supposed to do. But I got there and found that I absolutely loved it, and I'd kind of found my place. So I've got very fond memories of studying, of course, ancient Egypt, but also everything from forensic archaeology. We did a bit, that was a very popular course. Medieval cathedrals. I did a bit of Norse mythology. I even did a bit of old Icelandic language at one point. That was pretty tough.
Wow, that's cool.
So I was just completely immersed in the ancient world in archaeology, and I went to study in Birmingham, which is quite a rich area for history and heritage. But it was Egypt that really grabbed me, and I just decided that I wanted to keep going. So with support of my tutors, they encouraged me to do a master's degree. So I did a research master's, an MPhil, by this time specializing in Egyptology. By the time I finished my undergraduate degree, I was taking all the Egyptology options I could. So that meant a bit of archaeology, art history, religion, and the language as well, which is by far and away the hardest thing I had to do at university. And an ancient language it's just very hard.
I struggle with English.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, there's just loads of grammar to it. I think I certainly went into Old Icelandic thinking, oh, great, it's going to be runes. It's all going to be amazing. It's all going to be about Thor, and I'm going to read all about those things, and it will be really a great party trick to be able to read about runes. And actually, it wasn't. It was there was no ancient script to it. It was all just the language, and it was very grammar heavy. And Egyptian is just like that as well. You do need to know the script, but
that's one of the only reasons I didn't actually study classics at university, is because of
the language.
Having to learn a language with it.
I can't lie. It's not easy. And when you sit down, I wouldn't want to put anybody off, because I'm still enjoying it and really loving the whole thing 20 more plus years later. But when you sit down in the first sort of few lessons, and your tutor's saying, right, okay, so today suffix pronouns, and you think, what? And you get into past participles and relative forms and all this sort of stuff. And yeah, I mean, it is great, to be able to read text after a while, but you've got to battle through the grammar. If you don't know that, and a lot of us who are English speakers don't know our grammar very well, it's not easy. But I did a research master's, and my intention was to carry on and do a PhD pretty much straight away, just on the principle that I was going to sort of do whatever was next in front of me, and that was the logical next step. But a tutor actually encouraged me not to, on the basis that I would have been in my mid-20s at the oldest, if I went just straight on and carried on doing all the studying I could. And that I'd be pretty young for somebody with a PhD, but I'd have no experience of life or kind of work experience in the field, and I wouldn't know anybody either. I'd only know my tutors in Birmingham. There were no jobs in Birmingham. So this tutor said, look, go away, take a year away, try and get some experience on your CV. So go and do, for Egyptology, the kinds of things you might want to do are to get some experience working in a museum, work with some objects, try and get yourself some fieldwork experience, go and work for a digger in Egypt if you can. Try and maybe do some teaching. Doesn't have to be Egyptology teaching, but try and get some experience of teaching, and and do as many of those things that are Egyptology without formal study as you can. So I took this on board, applied to all the museums and field projects that I could, and at the same time I applied for every job in Egyptology that came up in the country for the experience of filling out application forms. And I thought, if I got an interview, that would be amazing, because I could use the experience as well. That would be good. And to my astonishment, I got 2 rejections just flat out. One from a very reputable institution I won't mention. Starts with British and ends with museum, which didn't even acknowledge applications. My tutor was very unhappy about this. I can remember him saying something like, "They can't even afford the price of a stamp." Something like that. Anyway, so I didn't get the job.
That was very Sean Connery from Indiana Jones.
It wasn't meant to be. That's not who taught me. And then I got another rejection from the University of Manchester, and then a very sort of junior administration position came up at the Egypt Exploration Society. So I went for that because, as I say, I was going for everything. I got an interview, which I thought was amazing. I was very excited. Did lots of prep, but again, I've no expectation of getting the job at this point. I went for the interview and I got the job. To my astonishment, this sort of ruined all my plans to take a year out, get some experience, and then go back to university. But it turned out, of course, to be absolutely brilliant for me, because it was a job. It was very badly paid. Well, no, it wasn't very well paid. I shouldn't be mean. And I was happy as Larry. I was in my early 20s. I was 22 when I got the job. I had a job in the offices were in Bloomsbury. So I had a full-time salary. I was working with people coming in through the door every day who'd written articles and books and things that I knew, that I'd read. So I was meeting all these people. I was doing things like licking stamps and putting them on envelopes and doing photocopying and reshelving library books and things. But meanwhile, I was picking up contacts and really rounding out my general knowledge. I was in charge of the library, so people would come in and say, have you got anything on Tuthmosis IV or something? And I wouldn't know anything about Tuthmosis IV, but by the time I'd helped them, I did know something about Tuthmosis IV. And from there, I just sort of took every opportunity that came along, and I stayed there for nearly 16 years in the end. So Wow. It turned out to be great advice. So that was a very long answer to your question about education, but
that's good. Yeah, lots of detail.
It was a tutor at university that set me on that path, and that was a really pivotal moment for me.
And you did go back to do your PhD in the end, did you?
I did, yeah, I did. So I had in that period when I was applying for everything, I managed to get myself some fieldwork experience. It was the only thing that came off of all this apart from the job at the EES. It was the only bit of work experience I applied for that I got. So I spent an incredibly hot season in Abydos in May 2001, and I was already working at the EES by the time that came round. And they generously allowed me to go off and do this because, you know, they were sort of supporting my Egyptological career, and they obviously had somebody else to lick stamps for a month. I decided I didn't want to go back on this project because I found it very tough, to be honest. It was really, really hot. I mean, that sounds like a stupid thing to say for somebody who's going to Egypt to spend a month in the desert, but it was unusually hot, sort of 50 degrees. And
Jesus.
it was very uncomfortable, and I found it very difficult to sleep, and that meant it was very difficult for me to stay awake during the day. So, and I was just drawing pottery. You know, I was given the sort of very junior most job as a volunteer on this project. And I just didn't enjoy it very much, and I didn't really feel like I'd made a very good impression. So I decided I probably wasn't going to go back. But a colleague at the ES said, "So what are you going to do now?" I said, "Well, you know, I don't know." And she said, "Well, where would you like to work?" And I said, "Well, I mean, you know, thinking you can't just go and work for whichever project you want." But I said, "What, you know, I mean, if I could go anywhere and go and work with the Italian mission to this 25th dynasty tomb in Luxor that I knew was going." And she basically said, "Right, I'll go and sort it out for you."
Wow.
So she did. So I ended up on my sort of dream project. And while I was out there, this completely restored all of my enthusiasm for doing Egyptology really properly and doing my studies and going back to my subject, 25th dynasty. And so I came home from that project determined to go and do a PhD, and I spoke to the ES about it and said, "Look, is there any chance that I could do this PhD and keep my job? So, you know, keep the job part-time, do the studying part-time." And they said, "Yeah." So I managed to do the PhD alongside my EES work. It took from start to finish, it took almost 8 years, which
8 years.
8 years, yeah.
Because that's obviously part-time, isn't it?
Part-time, and then with some fairly lengthy gaps of more than a year in some on several occasions. To be honest with you, in the grand scheme of things, I know of quite a lot of people who have taken longer than that. And I always kind of thought to myself, you know, I'm doing this in order to have a career. So the important thing is to keep my job at the ES going. And if that means the PhD taking a long time, then so be it. Having said that, having it hanging over you for 8 years is not something I'd recommend. Yeah, anyway, it all works out.
What is an actual average day for an Egyptologist? I suppose you'll say there isn't one because, you know, you're studying hieroglyphics, you're doing a bit of archaeology. You know, it sounds brilliant. I might go and do it, but what is an average day?
Well, so it varies. It will vary a lot depending on who you speak to. So, I mean, if I were a curator in a museum, then, you know, notwithstanding the coronavirus, I would be going into the department every day, and I would be probably working with objects some of the time. I might be writing exhibition catalogue entries, or, you know, that kind of thing. Equally, you know, if I was a university lecturer in Egyptology, I'd be going into the campus and doing my research and teaching. Most of my work is either writing or media kind of stuff. So I typically might be writing a proposal for a book. I'm just in the middle of doing something like that at the moment, on and off. I've got a book coming out on the 1st of October, so I'm just gearing up to start promoting that. So I'll be giving a lecture on that, on the subject of the book, on this Sunday coming up. So I'm prepping slides for a talk. I do a lot of lectures. So I spend a lot of time, certainly since the lockdown, on Zoom.
Are you like a guest lecturer, or are you tied to a university?
No, I'm not at all. So, the kind of lectures I would do are for specialist interest groups. So there's a lot of Egyptology societies in this country. So I can easily do sort of half a dozen of those every year, which takes me around the country. I occasionally get to speak to similar sorts of groups overseas. Since I've been writing books, I've found that promoting books takes me to things like literary festivals, takes me into bookshops to do little talks and then signings and that sort of thing. I also get, being on TV, doing TV work and being, sort of reasonably high profile in the media as Egyptologists go, means I quite often get asked to do talks on the basis of things that have been on TV. But since the lockdown, actually, it's of course, everything's had to shift online. So I have done a few talks at the invitation of specialist groups, but I've also started doing my own, just off my own bat, making use of a small following on social media, and that's something that's brand new for me, and I think it's brand new for just about everybody in Egyptology, at least. But it works really well. There's a global audience. So yeah, I mean, let's wait and see. I mean, certainly in the lockdown, the lectures seem to be quite popular, and I can reach more people online than I could by going, to a particular part of the UK.
And I think it draws more people in, because it's a lot easier to listen to a lecture on your sofa than it is to go and travel up to a London university or something, isn't it?
Yeah, it's absolutely right. I mean, when I first started doing these things as part of the lockdown, I really thought it was a kind of temporary stopgap, while in-person lectures weren't possible. And it just seems so obvious in hindsight, but once I started giving these, and the way I do them, at least, is actually following the Egypt Exploration Society's way of doing them, is to, obviously I have my video on, but nobody else has their video on, but they can post comments in the chat, and I tend to go on 10-15 minutes before the lecture starts, and people just say hi, hi, here I am in wherever, and my goodness me, people are all over the world, and I've had lots of people writing to me to say, Chris, I live in rural Missouri. I've never been to an Egyptology lecture in my life. This is incredible. Suddenly I can go to talks by all these people I see on TV, or all these people whose books I've read. This is amazing. The lockdown's been absolutely brilliant. So yeah, it looks like it's actually, as I say, with hindsight, it was really obvious that this was going to be possible.
Yeah.
But it's the lockdowns kind of kicked us into doing it, and I think it's going to be the way for the future.
Yeah, certainly. What would be some of the personality traits that you see in yourself, and probably some of your peers, that you think are really good for your field?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think it's got to be said that there's no point in doing this job unless you're really enthusiastic about your subject. The amount of time you have to put into it. There are far more qualified Egyptologists, even qualified up to PhD level, than there are jobs available, employment opportunities. So you've got to really, really want to do it. And even for those people who get jobs, there's probably a lot of, you're probably going to have to accept that there's going to be a long wait. Not very many people who do get jobs get them straight out of university. You've usually got to be doing other things for a few years. You've probably got to take lots of unpaid work. So it's got to be a passion. Depending on how you want to sort of apply your skills, some people are very good with reading ancient texts. So those people need to have a great kind of concentration, good language skills, good visual skills, good ability to read sometimes very badly written hieroglyphic or cursive signs. other people work on, say, archaeological excavations in Egypt, and those people might not read the Egyptian language at all, but they're very practical. They might be much better at reading, as it were, a landscape, or much better with recognizing objects, or detecting the difference between an 18th dynasty sherd of pottery and a 20th dynasty sherd of pottery. And then, if you're going to go into teaching or the media, like I ended up doing, you need to be able to communicate. Ultimately, the kind of currency that we use, that we work with, is information. Is knowledge. It's all about gathering that information and sharing it. And most people who are professional Egyptologists are academics. And their work is principally in sharing the knowledge and the interpretations with an academic audience. If you're teaching, so you're teaching undergraduate students, or you're teaching postgraduate students, or you're teaching at, say, evening class kind of level, or doing the kind of thing I'm doing, which is trying to explain things to non-specialist audiences in public lectures, or even on TV or in books or whatever, you've got to have good communication skills. You've got to be on top of the knowledge, but you've got to understand it in such a way as to be able to make it comprehensible for the people who are listening to you, and also interesting. I think that was one of the things I learned maybe while I was a student, maybe not long afterwards, was that even the very most highly regarded academics sometimes are not the best communicators. And if you're boring,
usually the way.
Yeah. If you're boring, then if your audience goes to sleep after a minute of your lecture, then it doesn't really matter what you've got to say. If you've lost them, then you're sunk. So I suppose that what I'm saying is there are lots of different qualities that might allow you to have a successful career in this kind of subject. And no one is sort of necessarily better than the other. There are lots of different niches for people to occupy. So
there's space for a huge plethora of different personalities and types of people. But you personally, what kind of positives and opportunities have you taken out of this career? I mean, you've mentioned you've done TV, you've written a book, and you're writing another one, which I think your first book is Lost Tombs of Egypt. I've actually seen that in the bookshop before. I'm gonna give that a read.
Oh, wow,
but what are your sort of the biggest positives and opportunities you taking out of this personally?
Well, I mean, like I say, I was fascinated by ancient Egypt as a kid, and I still am. I think understanding the way things were in the past, to put it in a very sort of simplistic way, helps us to understand ourselves and our own situation, our own sort of society and culture. And in some ways, if you study a culture like ancient Egypt, which is a long way removed from us in time and geography, and in lots of other ways as well, I suppose the immediate things you notice about people and how things were, how life was for people, is how different it is. But the more you learn, the more often you can see how things actually were quite sort of similar. So the value of studying Egyptology is the same as the value of studying any sort of branch of history. It gives us a perspective on our own lives and our own situations, and I love that. To think about sort of other things though. I mean, Egyptology and the opportunities I've had, and the way the subject has taken me, has meant that I've been able to travel to Egypt an awful lot. So the last time I counted, I was at just slightly over 40 visits, I think, to Egypt, which is a really incredible place. It's a very different culture from ours. It's a very beautiful place. I'm really sort of thankful for the opportunity to have been out there. It's a very beautiful place. I have an interest in photography. Going to Egypt has enabled me to indulge my sort of photographic side, if you like. I've also come to realize as well that it took me a long time to realize this, but I do really like writing. I like the process of writing. I have things to say, and I enjoy kind of crafting a sentence or an article, or these days every so often a book. And again, doing Egyptology and having an expertise in Egyptology has given me something to say, and I suppose things like TV and in particular have given me a platform. If it wasn't for working at the EES, I'd have never been invited to do TV. If it wasn't for TV, I'd have never been asked to do a book. And I like being able to share what I know, the expertise I have with an audience. And when I mention teaching, I don't do teaching as such, but in some sense, all these things, TV and writing and lecturing, they're all a kind of teaching. And there's a great sort of joy and pleasure to be had in learning a thing and getting excited about that thing and then sharing it with people. And I'm particularly conscious of that in my work now as a freelancer, because although I loved my time at the EES, I eventually came to be the chief executive of the Egypt Exploration Society, the director for a few years. And that was a great privilege, and I really enjoyed that. I learned a huge amount about how to run a small business, how to run a charity in that time. But I was doing a lot of administration and management by the end of it, and I'd kind of slightly drifted away from the Egyptology and the kind of knowledge and the sharing of knowledge, and I get to focus on that more. So I'm really conscious of that, and very happy now doing what I do. It's great. It's not my whole life. I doesn't take over my life. I still like guitars, and I still get to watch Arsenal occasionally, and I like gardening. But it's a great thing to do as a day job.
Yeah. So in contrast, what would be some of the less favourable sides of the career?
Well, I suppose most obviously
the heat.
Sorry.
The heat.
The heat. Yeah. Well, I was gonna say most obviously the job insecurity.
Okay.
I mean, I was very lucky because I was in the right place at the right time to take a junior administrative job, and once I got my foot in that particular door, the opportunities came along. And I am a kind of believer that you make your own luck to a certain extent, and I like to think that I took the opportunities that came along, but I'm sure also that I was in the right place at the right time to get that job. But having said that, again, I don't mean to cast aspersions on the ES, but it's not a wealthy sort of FTSE 100 index company. It's a small charity that, even though it's been going for more than 100 years, has always struggled for money and always endeavoured to put all its money into its excavations and its fieldwork. It's Egyptology, not into staff salaries. So it's not a very well paid thing to do. And now that I'm freelance, I've survived as a freelancer for almost 4 years now, but it's a precarious way of living, and I have to be constantly on the hunt for the next piece of work. And I'm constantly aware as well that if one day the TV companies decide that my face is too fat and wrinkled now, or the book, if my next book doesn't sell at all before I manage to get another one commissioned, then there won't be any more contracts coming my way, and I will have to go and do something else. So I'm sure that lots of people in lots of different jobs would say the same thing, that you don't become a millionaire instantly, and you never quite know if you're in a career for life or not. But I think Egyptology is definitely, that's why I say you've got to go into it for the passion.
we actually like to talk just a little bit about sort of salary expectations, and we've done a bit of research, and we'll just give you an average figure, and if that sort of sits right with you, let us know. So for sort of historians, Egyptologist kind of world, sort of maybe 22 up to maybe 32 is kind of the average.
I think it depends on what you're doing. If you're thinking about entering the world of Egyptology, you know, so a sort of entry level job, then certainly that's right. And I mean, it's a long time ago now, but when I started at the ES, my central London salary was 16,500. So, you know, you could add on a few grand, I suppose, for inflation these days, but still, you know, even with London weighting, it was low. Having said that, you know, I mean, there are roles in Egyptology. For example, you know, there is a professor of Egyptology at the University of Oxford. There is a keeper of the Egyptian department at the British Museum. Those are senior, very responsible roles, you know, for experienced academic in the case of the Oxford job, academic come sort of administrator come diplomat in the case of the British Museum role, and those will be rewarded much better. I genuinely couldn't tell you how much those people earn, but
whatever
of course
they get paid, they have the coolest job titles ever.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. But of course, you don't. You know, very, very, very few people ever get to that point. And you only get to those roles after years and years and years. And for what I do, for what it's worth, as I say, I mean, I'm freelance, so it's a bit more difficult to say exactly how much I earn, because because I'm not on a salary. But I don't meet the bottom end of your range. A lot of the time.
So we also quite like to ask, what is something that's not in the job description that you've had to deal with over the years?
Do you mean?
It could be something to do with actually being an Egyptologist, being on a dig, or anything really.
I suppose in my particular experience, as I mentioned, I became the director of the Egypt Exploration Society in 2012. I started, and I left after just shy of 5 years later. And that role was the role of a CEO of a charity, and that meant doing a lot of staff management, a lot of administration, a lot of finance management, you know, a lot of organizing of things, a lot of strategic type stuff. You know, what should charity be doing? You know, what's the charity's aims for the next 5 years? How do we invest our money? How do we generate income? You know, none of those things are things that I trained to do when I was at university. You know, those are all things that I learned on the job. So, you know, and I'm very grateful for the experience of having done those things, because I feel, you know, a few years later, having made all sorts of mistakes and you know, blunders and things over the years, I feel as though I learned a huge amount. And if actually, if I were to go back to a salaried job, I would be more likely to go now. You know, my skills as a sort of potential employee are in charity management, if you like, and I still do a little bit of that on the side, actually. But so those are, you know, those are things that I had to deal with in my career as a you know, Egyptologist in inverted commas. But all the things we've talked about, you know, reading hieroglyphs or working with objects or reading texts or doing research, or all those things sort of went out of the window, to be honest, during those years, even though I was in, you know, a sort of high profile Egyptologist's role.
So how does somebody progress within the industry? You know, you like we said, you've written books, you've done TV, you do a lot with the media, you essentially ran a small charity. How does somebody get in there and then work their way up?
That's a good question. I mean, as I mentioned, it is principally an academic field when it comes to earning a living. The lion's share of the jobs are academic, whether they are university based roles or museum based roles. The thing, positions like the one I had at the ES in charity management are much rarer. So in terms of how you get on the ladder, academic qualifications are essential. Most of those museum and university jobs these days will not even look at applications unless you have a PhD in hand. Wow. So before you've done anything, you at least need to be well on the way to getting a PhD. There are very few opportunities otherwise, and it's crazy. It's crazy. When you think that so much of the work that you might actually end up doing is not necessarily anything to do with academic research, the investment that you need to make in getting a PhD just to get to the point of being able to make a job application is something that people have to think very hard about. I wish this wasn't the system. I mean, I think PhDs are required partly because you acquire skills which will be useful and relevant in the job you might be applying for, but they're also just a way of whittling down applications, if you see what I mean. Because there are so many people who have qualifications. If the British Museum offered an opportunity for a curator in the Egyptian department, I imagine that they would probably get 200 or 300 applications from people with PhDs around the world. So if they were to say, look, you don't have to have a PhD, maybe only a master's degree would be okay, or an undergraduate degree, you can multiply that number by goodness knows how many. So it's I don't think this is a good situation myself, but it's the reality, and it is something that people would have to consider if they're really serious. You do have to have the expectation that you will be at least on your way, as I say, to getting a PhD. It's also true that it really, really helps to have made yourself known already. So if you've already got yourself a little bit of a reputation because you wrote a really great article, or you've done a couple of seasons on a project and you've proved yourself to be very capable but also a very likable person, these things help to frankly, it's just so competitive.
Is that one of the reasons you did a research masters, to get more publications out there?
That's a good question.
Because I did a talk masters and didn't put out maybe one publication, but obviously research masters, you do a lot more publications, and I wasn't sure, would that help? Do you think that would help in today's?
I honestly can't remember why I chose. I think it was simpler than that. It was the case that in Birmingham, where I was, the MA, the taught masters, replicated a lot of the things that undergraduate students would already have covered. Yeah. So in Birmingham, an MA in Egyptology was at least partly for people who'd done no Egyptology before at all, whereas the way I'd done it, I'd already done a module in language, a bit of art and archaeology, a bit of religion. So the research masters that I did it involved 2 taught courses, more language and more religion, and they might well have been the only things the university had to offer that I hadn't already taken. Okay. The other thing I think was that I already, by the point I was applying for my master's, I already had it in mind that I might not do an MPhil, but upgrade my MPhil to a PhD and just go straight ahead and do a BA and then a PhD. Yeah. It's only because of that tutor saying to me, no, finish your masters and go away for a year, that I decided to take the masters, as it were. But I didn't. I didn't publish anything as a result of my master's, and I've only published really 2 or 3 things that have sort of arisen as a result of my research. And I just put my PhD thesis itself, I made it available via academia freely online. I didn't take the trouble to work it up for publication as a book or anything like that. I was sick of it by then, to be honest.
If somebody was to come along to you and say, I'm going to give you an unlimited budget, put a team together, go to Egypt, what would you be going to look for? There must be something on your list, something we don't really know or understand about. What would it be?
Well, notwithstanding the enormous caveat that I'd be quite hesitant to take on a field project as director. I've never done this. I've never been a field director. It's a huge responsibility, and you need to get involved with all kinds of things like fundraising. But having said that, if that wasn't an object, if I had all the money in the world and all the permissions, my Lost Tombs book, it essentially is a kind of survey of spectacular discoveries waiting to be made. So I would either go to the North Saqqara Plateau, just a little way north of the Step Pyramid, to excavate what must be 2 very large tombs of the early Old Kingdom, one or the other of which could be the tomb of Imhotep. I suspect they probably aren't, but in any case, there's certainly something very big and spectacular to find there, which has never been excavated before. By the way, we know they're there from geophysical investigations. Either cool. That, or I'd like to see what more of ancient Alexandria there might be to see on land and off the coastline underwater in the Mediterranean, which it hasn't been possible to see so far. That would need megabucks, and even then, throwing megabucks at it might not get us very far. But we know relatively little about ancient Alexandria because it's either under the ocean or under the city. And the tombs of Alexander the Great and Cleopatra were both there at one point. And I'd love to know if there's anything of them left to find.
Well, if anyone's listening to this and wants to fund that trip, I will bring my spade.
I can certainly. I'll be happy to put together a budget, as long as the understanding is that sort of £1 million is the absolute minimum.
What do you think will be the next sort of key discovery in furthering our understanding of ancient Egypt? Obviously, we had the Rosetta Stone, which unlocked hieroglyphics, but what's something we're looking for that would really boost our knowledge?
Well, on that, I mentioned the Kingdom of Kush, which took over Egypt in the 25th dynasty, which was a very powerful kingdom, next door to the Egyptians, which is relatively little known. They wrote in hieroglyphs for part of their history. I mentioned they'd sort of taken on the trappings of Egyptian culture, but we are fairly sure, well, we're clear that they had their own language. So they were using the Egyptian script and language, but in some cases, but we can see that they had their own language too. And after a while, they started using their own script, which we call Meroitic, after the city of Meroe, which became the capital of Kush in its last phase. That script has never been deciphered. So if we were to find a kind of Rosetta Stone for Meroitic, which might, for example, have hieroglyphic Egyptian, Meroitic, and it would be very helpful if it had ancient Greek on it as well, then that would potentially be the key. A bilingual or trilingual inscription like the Rosetta Stone would potentially be the key to deciphering that language. That would be massive for our understanding of Kush. The other thing that I've talked about a lot and get asked about a lot is, whose tomb might be out there. I mentioned Imhotep, Alexander the Great, Cleopatra.
Yep.
Another one which is possibly out there is Nefertiti. If her tomb has yet to be found, and if it's intact, then that really would be sensational.
Yeah.
It might actually not tell us as much as a trilingual inscription helping us to decipher Meroitic, but it would get more headlines.
Yeah, that's true. Would you still go into the industry knowing what you know now?
Ooh. Well, I was very naive when I when I sort of staggered into it. Yeah, I would. If only because I say that if only because it's worked out fine. No regrets. I'm a firm believer in that as a kind of way of looking at life. But also, I have always taken the approach that I will do this job only for as long as I enjoy it, and fully in the expectation that my luck might run out at some point. But at that point, I'll go and do something else I enjoy, or I'll throw my heart and soul into doing something else that I enjoy. So maybe that's not quite an answer to your question, but I'm sort of hoping that might be
that's
a useful kind of way of looking at it. I think what I'm trying to say is, if you enjoy doing Egyptology and you fancy trying it, don't think to yourself, what is the 50-year career path that I might take now, and how do I get to year 50 without making any mistakes, no deviations, that sort of thing. Just think to yourself, if this looks like something that's going to be good, what might I do next? And what do I see myself doing in a year or 3 years or 5 years? That was the sort of furthest ahead I ever thought, and that served me quite well. So yeah. I mean, and I say this. You may be surprised to know that I'm not quite at retirement age yet, and I don't know if I will retire as an Egyptologist or as a rock star footballer or gardener. I don't know.
Never give up hope.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, my real career hasn't started.
Thank you so much for coming on, Chris. I've had an absolute
incredible
history sort of geek fest, and I've loved it.
It's been a pleasure.
Where can people find you on social media and your work?
So my website is chrisnaunton.com. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you search for @Chris Naunton, or one word, you should find me on in any of those places. Do come say hi.
And we will keep a lookout for that new book.
Oh yeah, please do. Yeah, if I may, Egyptologist's Notebooks, a pictorial history of Egyptology, out on the 1st of October.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
No problem. Thanks for the invite. Cheers, guys.
Cheers, Chris. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.